So, you want to buy a gas station. Cars pull in constantly, prices are posted right there on the sign for the whole street to see, and every fill-up rings the register. Here's the part nobody tells you. On the fuel itself, you're barely making anything at all. The real business and the real risk is almost entirely somewhere else. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole business. And once you understand where the actual money comes from, you'll never look at a gas station sign the same way again. Let's start with what it costs to get into this business in the first place, because the range is enormous depending on how you enter it. Buying an existing small station can run anywhere from $250,000 to $2 million. Building one from scratch with a full convenience store attached typically costs between $2 and $7 million, with the bulk of that expense going toward environmental compliance, underground storage tanks, and high-speed fuel pumps. Go the franchise route with a major brand, and total investment can range from a few $100,000 into the multiple millions, depending on the brand, plus an ongoing franchise fee, and, in many cases, a cut of your gross profit going straight back to the franchisor. However you get in, you're not just buying a building with pumps in front of it, you're buying into a regulated, contract-driven infrastructure business wearing a retail storefront. Now here's the number that surprises almost everyone considering this business. Ask the average driver how much profit a gas station makes on a gallon of gas, and surveys show nearly half of them guess it's around $2 a gallon. If that were true, a typical station selling 1.5 million gallons a year would be pulling in $3 million in pure profit annually, and every gas station owner in America would be a millionaire many times over. That is not remotely close to reality. The actual gross margin, the gap between what a retailer pays at the terminal and what they charge at the pump, averages around 30 to 40 cents a gallon. And gross margin is not profit. Subtract the cost of distributing that fuel from the terminal to the station, subtract credit card processing fees, which alone can run 8 cents a gallon or more, and subtract everything else that goes into keeping the pumps running, and the actual net profit that lands in the owner's pocket is typically somewhere between 3 and 12 cents a gallon. On a station selling 4,000 gallons a day, that works out to somewhere between $120 and $400 a day in profit from fuel. Not from the whole business, just from the fuel. So where does the real money actually come from? Almost entirely from the building behind the pumps. Industry data consistently shows that while fuel accounts for 60 to 70% of a typical station's total revenue, it generates only around 30% of total profit. The convenience store, meanwhile, generates the other 70% of profit from just 30 to 40% of revenue, because the margins inside that building are in an entirely different universe from the margins at the pump. Packaged snacks and candy run 30 to 40% gross margin. Fountain drinks and coffee, thanks to genuinely tiny input costs, can hit 60% margin or higher. Prepared hot food, the roller grill items, the sandwiches, can reach 65% margin. A car wash, if the station has one, can run margins as high as 60 to 70%. This is the actual structure of the business once you strip away the sign out front. Fuel is not the product. Fuel is the advertisement. It's what gets a car to slow down, pull in, and put a human being within walking distance of a coffee machine with a 60% margin. That reframes the entire real estate calculation too. In this industry, professionals talk about being on the correct side of the road, not just a busy one. A station on the going home side of a commuter route sees customers who are relaxed and willing to browse, buying milk, snacks, a six-pack on the way home. The exact same station on the going-to-work side of that same road sees customers in a rush, grabbing fuel and maybe a coffee before speeding off. Same traffic count, very different in-store revenue. The fuel-to-inside sales ratio, roughly $1 of inside sales for every 2 gallons pumped at a healthy location, is one of the most closely watched numbers in the business, because a station pumping huge fuel volume with weak inside sales isn't actually a thriving business. It's a low-margin utility service that happens to have a building attached. Now here's the cost category that doesn't show up on any of those margin calculations at all, and it's the one that can end the entire business overnight. Underground storage tanks. Every station stores tens of thousands of gallons of fuel in large tanks buried beneath the property, and those tanks, along with the pumps and pipes connected to them, corrode over time. When they leak, even a small amount of gasoline can travel remarkably far. 10 gallons of leaked fuel can contaminate 12 million gallons of groundwater. Nationwide, more than 500,000 confirmed leaks have been reported at fuel storage sites, and the federal government has estimated the total cleanup bill across the industry at more than $20 billion. An average cleanup runs around $154,000. But if the leak reaches groundwater and correcting groundwater contamination is a different order of problem entirely. Remediation costs can run anywhere from $100,000 to well over $1 million, and that bill typically lands on whoever owns the property at the time the contamination is discovered, regardless of who actually caused the leak years or even decades earlier. This creates one of the strangest liability traps in small business ownership. Old purchase agreements in this industry have historically included clauses where the seller indemnifies themselves against any harm caused by a leak, shifting that responsibility entirely onto the new owner, even for tanks that were already corroding underground before the sale ever closed. You can buy a gas station, run it cleanly for years, and still end up personally on the hook for contamination that started decades before you ever signed the paperwork, discovered only when a routine inspection or a nearby property sale finally brings it to light. There's a different kind of structural risk in this business, though, one that doesn't require any environmental disaster at all, just a broken link in the supply chain. Mountain Express Oil Company, founded in 2000, grew into a major fuel distributor supplying more than 800 fueling centers in 27 travel centers across 27 states. In August of 2023, the company filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy liquidation. For the independent retailers who depended on Mountain Express as their exclusive fuel supplier under long-term contracts, the collapse didn't just mean a paperwork headache. It meant their fuel simply stopped arriving. One retailer operating 8 convenience stores in the Dallas area, contractually locked into buying exclusively from Mountain Express, went 90 days without consistently receiving fuel or even their own credit card sale proceeds, and reported losses of roughly $4 million combined in lost fuel and retail revenue. Another operator with 40 locations across Louisiana and Mississippi had fuel cut off to nearly all of its stores at once, forcing 11 locations to close their doors completely within days, simply because the single company they were contractually obligated to buy fuel from no longer existed in any functional sense. A separate group of 6 New York retailers described themselves as being on the verge of shuttering entirely before a bankruptcy court finally granted them emergency permission to buy fuel from someone else. One chain in Michigan and Wisconsin, leasing its properties directly from Mountain Express, was forced to shut down all 25 of its locations the following year when the fallout from that original bankruptcy finally caught up with its own lease structure. Here's the structural lesson underneath that story. None of these retailers did anything wrong. Their stores were fine. Their fuel margins were fine by industry standards. What destroyed them was a single point of failure sitting one contractual layer above their own business, a supplier they had no ownership stake in and no ability to influence, whose bankruptcy became their crisis purely because an exclusive supply agreement had made them entirely dependent on one company's continued existence. A gas station's fuel margin can be perfectly healthy on paper and still be worthless the moment the fuel itself stops showing up. Now compare that to what happens when an operator abandons the traditional model almost entirely. Buc-ee's opened its first location in Clute, Texas in 1982, founded on 2 simple priorities: sell cheap ice and keep the bathroom spotless. For decades, it grew quietly as a regional Texas chain, then starting with an expanded location in 2003 and accelerating through the 2010s, the company built what the industry now recognizes as an entirely inverted business model. Instead of treating fuel as the profit center and the convenience store as an afterthought, Buc-ee's treats fuel as a loss leader, priced aggressively low purely to pull cars off the highway, and builds enormous 50,000 to 74,000 square foot destinations designed to maximize how much time and money a visitor spends once they're inside. The results are almost unbelievable by industry standards. The average American convenience store generates somewhere around $5.5 million in annual revenue per location. A single Buc-ee's location is estimated to generate somewhere between $50 and $100 million a year, roughly 10 to 20 times the industry average, from a private company that by 2015 had grown its total revenue from $202 million to $959 million in less than a decade. The mechanics behind that number are almost entirely about the in-store side of the business. Roughly 2/3 of Buc-ee's total revenue comes from food, merchandise, and its own Beaver-branded product line, sold at gross margins estimated around 35 to 40%, well above the industry average for convenience retail. Because much of that merchandise is private label, the company captures both the manufacturer's margin and the retailer's margin on the same product. And the company deliberately doesn't sell any of it online, creating genuine scarcity that drives a third-party resale market and, more importantly, forces anyone who wants a Buc-ee's branded item to physically drive to a Buc-ee's to get it. The difference between the retailers destroyed by the Mountain Express bankruptcy and Buc-ee's extraordinary per-store revenue wasn't luck, and it wasn't simply operational excellence in some generic sense. It was a fundamentally different relationship to the exact same commodity. The failed retailers had built their entire business around a thin fuel margin, delivered through a single point of contractual dependency they didn't control. Buc-ee's built its business around treating that same thin, unreliable fuel margin as bait, never as the actual product, and put its energy entirely into the one part of the business, the convenience store, where margins are wide, dependencies are diversified across dozens of vendors instead of one exclusive supplier, and a bankruptcy anywhere else in the fuel supply chain barely registers. That brings us to the structural risk sitting underneath this entire industry. And it isn't the price of oil, and it usually isn't even the environmental liability. Real as that risk is, it's dependency concentration on a fuel margin that's already razor thin, on a single supplier contract that can collapse without warning, and on a convenience store offer that either becomes wide enough to carry the business or leaves the owner exposed to a commodity margin that was never big enough to support a real business on its own. Zoom out across the industry, and the pattern becomes obvious. The gas stations that thrive over the long run are almost never the ones treating fuel as their core product. They're the ones that understood, early and completely, that the pumps exist to create foot traffic, that the real profit lives entirely inside the building behind them, and that diversifying vendor relationships and revenue streams matters just as much as any single number on the price sign outside. The gas stations that fail are almost always the ones caught in exactly the trap that ended Mountain Express's retailers: a thin margin, a single point of supply dependency, and no meaningful in-store offer wide enough to absorb the shock when that one point of failure finally breaks. So, does owning a gas station actually work as a business? The honest answer depends almost entirely on whether you understand, from day one, what you're actually selling. In the optimistic version, you build or acquire a location with genuine in-store potential. Diversify your fuel supply relationships, so no single bankruptcy can shut off your pumps overnight, and treat the convenience store as the actual engine of the business, rather than an afterthought, the way Buc-ee's turned a modest 1982 gas station into locations generating tens of millions of dollars a year each. In the realistic bad version, you're running a thin-margin fuel operation locked into a single exclusive supplier contract with a convenience store that never became wide enough to carry the weight of the business, and one bankruptcy, one leak, one broken link in a supply chain you never controlled in the first place is enough to end it entirely. Neither outcome has much to do with how many cars pull up to the pumps on a given day. A gas station was never really in the business of selling gasoline. It's a real estate and retail operation that happens to use a commodity nobody makes any real money on to get people to stop.